Hi guys, today I'm going to be reading from chapter 4 from Alas Babylon. Helen Bragg's battle was over and she had lost. The tickets were in her handbag, their luggage. Marc had made them pack almost all the extra clothes they owned and paid an outrageous sum for the extra weight. Was piled on the baggage cart, already wheeled out on the concrete, fine snow settling on it. She had lost, and yet 15 minutes before plane time, she still protested, not in the hope that Marc would change his mind. It was simply that she felt miserable and guilty. She said, "I still don't think I ought to go. I feel like a deserter." They stood together in the terminal lobby, a tiny island oblivious to the human eddies around them. Her gloved hand held to his arm. Her cheek was pressed tightly against his shoulder. He pressed her hand and said, "Don't be silly. Anybody with any sense gets out of a primary target area at a time like this. You aren't the first to leave, and you won't be the last. That doesn't make it right, and it isn't right. My place is here with you." He pulled her around to face him, so that her upturned mouth was inches from his own. "That's just it. You can't stay with me. If and when it comes, I'll be in the hole, protected by the 50 feet of concrete and steel and good earth. That's where my place is, and that's where you can't be. You'd be somewhere on the surface exposed. If you could come down into the hole with me, then you could stay, darling." This was something that he had not said before, a fact she had not considered. Somehow it made her feel a bit better, yet she continued to argue, although dispiritedly. "Still, I think my job is here." His fingers banded her arm when he spoke. His voice was flat, a direct order. "Your job is to survive, because if you don't, the children won't survive. That is your job. There is no other. You understand that, Helen?" On the other side of the drafty terminal, Ben Franklin and Peyton buzzed around the newsstand, each with $1 to spend on candy, gum, and magazines. They only knew that they were getting out of school a week early and that they were spending Christmas vacation in Florida. That's all that Helen had told them, and in the excitement of packing and greeting their father and then packing more bags, there had been no questions. Helen said, "I understand." Her head dropped against Marc's chest. "If this business blows over, you'll let us come right home, won't you?" "Sure. You promise?" "Certainly I promise." Maybe we could come home. Maybe we could be home before the next school term. Don't count on it, darling, but I'll call you every day. And as soon as I think it's safe, I'll give the word. The loudspeaker announced Flight 714 for Chicago, connecting with flights east and south. The children ran over to them. Peyton carried a quiver and bow slung over her shoulder. Ben Franklin a cased spinning rod, his Christmas present from Randy the year before. Marc shepherded them outside and toward Gate 3. He lifted Peyton off the ground and held her a moment and kissed her, disarranging her red knitted cap. "My hair," she said, laughing, and he put her down. He noticed other passengers filtering through the gate. He drew Ben Franklin aside, and he said, "Behave yourself, son." Ben looked up at him, his brown eyes troubled, and when he spoke, his voice was intentionally low. "This is an evacuation, isn't it, Dad?" "Yes." It was Marc's policy never to utter an untruth when replying to a question from the children. "I knew it as soon as I got home from school. Usually Mother gets all excited and happy about traveling, but not today. She hated to pack, so I knew it. I hate to send you away, but it's necessary." Looking at Ben Franklin was like looking at a snapshot of himself in an old album. "You'll have to be the man of the family for a while. Don't worry about us. We'll be okay in Fort Repose. I'm worried about you." The boy's eyes were filling. Ben Franklin was a child of the atomic age and knowledgeable. "I'll be all right in the hole. Not if..." Anyway, Dad, you don't have to worry about us, he repeated. So, we have been introduced to Helen Bragg. This is Marc's wife, and Ben Franklin and Peyton, and those are Marc's children, okay? They are Randy's niece and nephew. And here, when it says that Ben Franklin is a child of the atomic age, he's wise beyond his years. He really does have an idea as to what is going on and the dangers that are out there in the world. And that's one of the reasons why the writer chose to make that comment. So he really does know what's going on. Then it was time. Marc walked them to the gate, Peyton's glove in his left hand, Ben Franklin's in his right. Helen turned and he kissed her once and said, "Goodbye, darling. I'll phone you tomorrow afternoon. I've got the duty tonight and I'll probably sleep all morning, but I'll call as soon as I get up." She managed to say, "Tomorrow." He watched them walk to the plane, a small procession, and out of his life. At 9 o'clock, Randy awoke, aware of a half a dozen problems accumulated in his subconscious. The problem of transportation he had neglected entirely. He certainly ought to have a reserve of gas and oil, and half his grocery list remained to be purchased. He had not yet filled Dan Gunn's prescriptions, and he had yet to visit Bubba Offenhouse and collect civil defense pamphlets. He went into his bathroom and turned on the lights and washed the sleep out of his eyes. Lights! What would happen if the lights went out? Several boxes of candles, 2 old-fashioned kerosene lamps, and 3 flashlights were cached in the sideboard downstairs, a provision against hurricane season. He had a flashlight in his bedroom and another in the car. He added candles, kerosene, and flashlight batteries to his list. Everything except the gasoline would have to wait till tomorrow anyway. With Helen to help him fill in the gaps, it would be easy to lay into all the essentials on Sunday. So remember, just as I had mentioned in Chapter 3, think about all of the things that you would want to have in order to a survival kit, so to speak. Okay, as if we were planning for a hurricane. What are your things that you need to have? Keep that in mind. He changed his clothes, shivering. The nights were getting cooler. Downstairs, the barometer read 61, and he turned up the thermostat. The Bragg house had no cellar. They were rare in Central Florida, but it did have a furnace room and was efficiently heated by oil. He doubted that he'd have to worry about oil. The fuel tank had been filled in November, and thus far in the winter had been mild. In the garage, Randy found 2 empty 5-gallon gasoline cans. He put them in the car trunk and drove to town. Jerry Kling's station was still open, but Jerry had already turned off his neon sign and was checking the cash register. Jerry filled the tank and the 2 extra cans, and then as an afterthought, Randy asked for a gallon of kerosene and 5 extra quarts of oil. Driving back on River Road, Randy slowed when he reached the McGoverns. All the lights were on in the McGovern house. He turned into the driveway. It was 10:30. It was not necessary that he leave for the Orlando airport until 2 a.m. Now again, we're going to get into some of the more technical part where they are describing the military, okay? Do your best to keep up, and I will try and provide a little summary at the end. It was near dawn in the eastern Mediterranean when Saratoga, working up speed in narrowing waters between Cyprus and Lebanon, catapulted 4 F-11F Tigers, the fastest fighters in its complement. By then, the reconnaissance jet that had shadowed Task Group 6.7 through the darkness hours had vanished from the radar screens. The Admiral's staff was convinced another would soon take its place, as on the previous morning. But this day, the snooper would receive a surprise. Task Group 6.7's primary mission was to take station in the Iskenderun Gulf and give heart to the Turks, who were under heavy political and propaganda pressure. The force's security would be endangered if its perilously tight formation in this confined area was observed. Quite often, the flood of history is undammed or diverted by the character and actions of one man. In this case, the man was not an official in Washington or the admiral commanding Task Group 6.7 or even the captain or air commander of Saratoga. The man was Ensign James Cobb, nicknamed Peewee, the youngest and smallest pilot in Fighter Squadron 44. Listen to this again. Quite often, the flood of history is undammed or diverted by the character and actions of one man. So, whatever Peewee Cobb is getting ready to do is going to basically drive the action and the fate of the characters and of this book. Ensign Cobb was assigned combat air patrol duty on the Saturday morning simply because it was his turn. He was scarcely 5 feet 6 inches tall, weighed 124, and looked younger than his 23 years. Under a flat-top haircut, his red head appeared knobby and outsized. His face was pinched and mottled with freckles, and in the presence of girls, he was shy to the point of panic. In the wonderful ports of Naples, Nice, and Istanbul, he distinguished himself as the only pilot in the Fighting 44 who never found reason to request a night's liberty ashore. When they're requesting a night's liberty ashore, they're asking for time off, hopefully to go take a girl on a date. When he climbed into the cockpit of his aircraft, Peewee Cobb's whole character changed. The instant his hands and feet were on the controls, he became as large and as fast as his supersonic fighter, and as powerful as its armament. As compensation for outer physical deficiencies, he was gifted with superb reactions and eyesight. He was rated superior in rocketry and gunnery. He got a fierce thrill in pushing his F-11F through the Mach and to the limit of its capability. He would outfly anybody in the squadron, including the lieutenant commander, who led it, and who had once said, "Peewee may be a mouse aboard ship, but he is a tiger in a tiger. If I sent him up with orders to shoot down the moon, he'd try." Now, for the first time, Peewee Cobb was flying CAP under wartime conditions in a fighter armed with live rockets and with orders to intercept and destroy a snooper if it appeared. Climbing steadily in the darkness, he prayed that if the bogey came back, it would attempt to penetrate his sector. If it did, nobody would laugh at his size, his squeaky voice, his face, or his ineffectual awkwardness with women ever again. Peewee Cobb had been given a code name, Sunflower 4, and instructions to orbit over an area of sea off Haifa, astern of Task Group 6.7. If the hostile reconnaissance jet came in from a base in Egypt or Albania, he would be in a position to intercept. His fighter was armed with sidewinders, ingenious single-minded rockets, heat seekers. A sidewinder's nose was sensitive to infrared rays from any heat source. Peewee had fired two in practice. They had not only had destroyed the targets, but had unintentionally vanished up the tailpipes of the drones. At 30,000 feet, Peewee judged he was on station and called for a radar fix. The missile cruiser Canberra, closest ship in the formation, confirmed his position. As he circled the sky in the southeast, grew light. Then, gradually, the shape and color of the sea and earth became plain. He felt entirely alone and apart from this transformation, as if he watched from a separate planet. He checked his map. Far to the east, he picked out Mount Carmel and a river, and beyond were the hills of Megiddo, also called Armageddon. He continued to orbit. His earphones crackled, and he acknowledged Saratoga. the flight controller's voice said, "Sunflower 4, we have a bogey. He's at angles 25. His speed, 500 knots. Your intercept course is 30 degrees. Go get him." So, the snooper was already north of him and racing up the coast, hoping to hang on to the flank of the task group and observe it by radar from a position close to friendly Syrian territory. Peewee took his heading and pushed his throttle up to 99% power. He slid through the Mach with a slight thrilling tremor. Every 15 or 20 seconds, he made minute alterations in course in response to directions from Saratoga, which was holding both planes on its screens. And then he saw it, flicker of sun on metal, diving at great speed, and he pushed the Tiger's nose over and followed, reporting, "I am closing target." He touched the switch that armed his rockets, and another calling for manual fire, singingly. The chase had carried him down to 9,000 feet, and the bogey was still losing altitude. It was a 2-engine jet, an IL-33, Peewee believed, and remarkably fast at this low level. There was no doubt that the bogey knew he was on its tail, for reconnaissance aircraft could be well equipped with radar. His speed held steady at Mach 1.5, but his rate of closure slowed. Far ahead, Peewee saw the Syrian port of Latakia, reputedly built into an important Red submarine base, Red meaning Russians. Within a few seconds, he would be within Syrian territorial waters, and a few more would carry him over the port itself. At this point, Peewee should have dropped the chase, for they had been strictly warned in the briefing against violating anyone's orders. He hung on. In another 5 seconds, the bogey jinked violently to the right, heading for the port and its anti-aircraft and rocket batteries, and perhaps the sanctuary of an airfield in the brown hills and dunes beyond. Peewee turned the F-11F inside him, instantly shortening the range. He pushed the firing button. The Sidewinder, leaving a thin pencil mark of smoke, rushed out ahead. For an instant, the Sidewinder seemed to be following the flight of the bogey beautifully, and Peewee waited for it to merge into the tailpipe of one of the jet engines. Then, the Sidewinder seemed to waver in its course. Peewee thought, but he could not be certain, that the bogey had cut its engines and was now in a steep glide. Following the Sidewinder, Peewee lost sight of the bogey. The Sidewinder darted down toward the dock area of Latakia. It seemed to be chasing a train. That crazy rocket, Peewee thought. There was an orange flash, an enormous ball of brown smoke, and black bits of debris rushing up to meet him. Peewee kicked his rudder hard and climbed away from it, compressed within his G-suit and momentarily losing his vision. Then, the shock wave kicked him in the rear and he was over the Mediterranean again. He was asking for a vector back to his ship when another flash reflected on his instrument panel. He banked to look back and saw a black cloud, red flames at its base, rising from Latakia. 15 minutes later, Ensign Cobb, freckles standing out on his white face like painted splotches, was standing in Admiral's country of Saratoga, trying to explain what had happened. When you're saying the Admiral's country of the Saratoga, they're talking about the Admiral's office. And if you have to go see the Admiral, that is not a good thing. So basically, unintentionally, Peewee Cobb has blown up the port of Latakia, and it is a secret military base for the Russians. I would like to point out, it wasn't necessarily an attack, it was an accident. The Sidewinder did not go where it was supposed to go. And before we continue, I'm going to read this line to you one more time. I want you to think about it. Quite often, the flood of history is undammed or diverted by the character and actions of one man. And we are back to Fort Repose. Randy Bragg pulled up in the rear driveway of the McGovern house, wondering whether he should go in. He was not exactly popular with the elder McGoverns, which was why Lib visited him more often than he visited her. Whenever he entered the McGovern home, Randy felt as if he were stepping into an enormous department store window. Pay close attention now to the design and construction of this house. Just pay attention. The entire front of the house facing the Temecwan was plate glass, clamped between thin stainless steel supports, and every piece of furniture appeared unused, as if a price tag and warranty would be found tied to one of the legs. Lavinia McGovern herself had thought up the basic plan, collaborated with the architect, and supervised the construction. The architect, pleading a hotel commission in Miami, had returned part of his fee and absented himself from court repose before the foundation was even laid. On the first visit, Randy had not endeared himself to Lavinia. She took him what she called the grand tour, proudly showing off the multiple heat pumps, ensuring constant year-round temperature, the magnificent kitchen with electric ovens and broilers operated from a central control panel, the cunning round holes in the ceiling which sprayed gentle light on dining room, table, bar, bridge table, and strategically located abstract statuary, and television screens fared into the walls of bedrooms, living room, dining room, and even kitchen and the master bedroom's free-form tub, which extended through the wall and into a tiny shielding garden. There were no fireplaces, which she called soot producers, or bookshelves, which she called dust catchers. All was new, modern, and functional. When we came down here, Lavinia said, we got rid of everything in Shaker Heights and started fresh, bright and new. See how I brought the river right to our feet? She indicated the expanse of glass. What do you think of it? Randy tried to be once tactful and truthful. It reminds me of an illustration out of Modern Living, but, Lavinia inquired nervously. Randy, feeling that he was being helpful, pointed out in the summer months that the sun's direct rays would pour through the glass walls and that the afternoon heat would become unbearable. And no matter how large and efficient the air conditioning system is, I'm afraid that in the summer you're going to have to shutter the whole southwest side of the house, he said. Is there anything else that you think is wrong? Lavinia asked, her voice dangerously sweet. Well, yes, that indoor-outdoor bath is charming and original, but come spring it'll be a freeway for moccasins and water snakes. Well, in cool nights they'll plop in and swim or crawl right into the house. At this point, Lavinia had squealed and clutched at her throat as if suffocating, and her husband and daughter had half carried her to the bedroom. The next day, plumbers and masons remodeled the sunken tub, eliminating the outdoor feature. Later, Lib explained that her mother dreaded snakes had been solely responsible for the design of the house. Randy never felt comfortable in Lavinia's presence thereafter, and Lavinia, while attempting to be gracious, sometimes grew pale and faint when he appeared. Randy's relations with Bill McGovern were little better. On occasion, after a few extra drinks, he disagreed with Mr. McGovern on matters political, social, and economic. Since Bill, for so many years, had been president of a manufacturing concern employing 6,000 people, few of whom ever disagreed with him about anything, and he had been affronted and angry. He considered Randy an insolent young loafer, an example of decadence in what once might have been a good family, and a sadly scrambled egghead, and he had informed his daughter of such. So, Randy, sitting in his car, hesitated. He was certain to be coolly received, and Lib didn't expect to see him until the next day, but he had a hunch she needed him now. He guessed a considerable argument was going on inside, and Lib would be verbally overpowered by her father, and Marc's warnings go unheeded. Randy got out of his car. Lib opened the north door before he could ring. I thought I heard a car in the drive, she said. I'm glad it's you. I've got troubles. Bill McGovern was standing in the living room, wrapped in an ankle-length white robe, smiling as if nothing were funny. Lavinia McGovern, her eyes swollen and pink against pallid skin, lay back on a chaise. She held a handkerchief to her nose, and Bill was bald, square-shouldered, and rather tall. His nose was beaked and his chin prominent and strong. In his toga of toweling, and with feet encased in leather sandals, he looked like an angry Caesar. "So here comes our local Paul Revere," he greeted Randy. "What are you trying to do, frighten my wife and daughter to death?" Randy regretted having come in, but now that he was in, he saw no point in being anything less than frank. "Mr. McGovern," he said. Ordinarily, he addressed Lib's father as Bill. "You aren't as bright as I thought. If I gave you a hot tip from a good source on the market, you would listen. This is somewhat more important than the market, and I thought I was doing you a favor." He turned to leave. Lib touched his arm. "Please, Randy, don't go." "Elizabeth?" Her parents were present. He always called her Elizabeth. "I'll leave things the way they are. If you need me, call." Lavinia began to sniffle audibly, and in a worried voice, Bill said, "Now don't rush off half-cocked, Randy. I'm sorry if I was rude. There are just certain things that you don't understand." "Like what?" Randy asked. Bill's voice was conciliatory. "Just sit down and I'll explain." Randy continued to stand. "Now I'm twice as old as you are," Bill said, "and I think I know more about what goes on in the world. After all, I know quite a few big men, the biggest, and all these war scares are concocted by the Pentagon, no offense meant to your brother, to get more appropriations and give more handouts to Europe and jack up taxes. It's all part of the damnable inflationary pattern. It's designed to cheat people in pensions and with fixed incomes and so forth. Now, I know your brother thinks he's doing the right thing, and I appreciate you telling Elizabeth, but chances are your brother's been taken in too." "Have you been listening to the news for the past few days?" "Yes. Oh, I'll admit it looks bad in the Mid-East. But that doesn't scare me. We might have a little brush fire, like Korea, sure, but no atomic war. Nobody's going to use atomic bombs, just like nobody used gas in the last war." "You'll guarantee that, huh, Bill?" Bill locked his hands behind his back. "I can't guarantee it, of course, but only the other day I was talking to Mr. Offenhouse. You know him, runs civil defense here. Well, he isn't worried. Says the only real danger we face is being overrun by people swarming out of Orlando and Tampa. He doesn't think that there's much of a chance of that. Port Repose isn't on any main highways, but he does say that we'll have to watch out for the dinges, keep them under control." "Please, Bill," Lavinia said, "say darkies." "Darkies? Hell, the dinges are likely to panic and start looting. Oh, the local niggers like Daisy, our cook, and Missouri, the cleaning woman, may be all right, but Mr. Offenhouse was talking about the migrant labor, the orange pickers, and so forth. So if Mr. Offenhouse isn't worried, then I'm not worried. Mr. Offenhouse strikes me as a pretty solid businessman." Again, regarding the use of the N-word, I am only reading it because it is printed in the book. However, I have made my feelings regarding this word crystal clear, definitely in the first portion of the book. I find it very offensive, and it is not something that is a part of my vocabulary. Randy knew that Bubba Offenhouse had been picked to head civil defense because he owned the only 2 ambulances, which, with the addition of black scroll work, also doubled as hearses in Fort Repose. "Did you talk to him about fallout?" he asked. "Well, no, I didn't," Bill said. "Mr. Offenhouse said that they sent him some booklets from Washington, but that he's not passing them around because they're too gruesome. Says, why worry about something you can't see, feel, hear, or smell? Says it's just so bad to frighten people to death as kill them with radiation, and I must say that I agree with him." So, first mistake. Bubba Offenhouse does not pass out the civil defense pamphlets to the community, so they have no idea what's coming, and they have had 0 time to prepare. Lavinia said, "If it came, I suppose we'd have rationing like last time and all kinds of shortages. Bill, don't you think we ought to—" "No, I won't think of it. Please, let's not talk about it anymore. It's horrid." She dabbed at her eyes and tried to smile. "Randolph, when your sister comes, won't you please bring her over for dinner? And afterwards we could play bridge. Perhaps you'd like to play a rubber now. I know you're going to stay up to meet the plane, and I'm so overwrought I can't sleep. I'm sure Helen will be delighted to come to dinner, Randy said, and as for bridge, I'll take a rain check. I still have some things to do at home. Good night, Lavinia. Sorry I upset you. Lib came out to the car with him. Didn't get very far, did I? He said. You started Dad thinking. That's far. Overhead, he heard multi-engined jets. On that night, there was a 3/4 of the moon, and he looked up, seeing nothing, and knew the jets were military aircraft, too high for their running lights to show against the bright sky. On any night, if you listened for a while, you could hear the B-52s and 47s and 58s. But on this night, there seemed to be more of them. Where are they from? Lib asked. Where are they going? I guess they're from McCoy and MacDill and Eglin and Homestead, Randy said, and I don't think we're going anywhere much. They're just stooging around up there because they're safer up there than on the ground. When you can hear them floating around like that high, you know you're all right. I see, Lib said. For the second time, he kissed her good night. When he reached home, it was almost midnight. He made coffee and, yawning, turned on the radio and turned on an Orlando station for the late network news. The first bulletin jerked him wide awake. Again, remember that the story is also told through some news reports. From Washington, the official Arab radio in a broadcast from Damascus claims that American carrier planes are conducting a violent bombing attack on the harbor of Latakia. The news broke in Washington just a few minutes ago. Okay, we actually know what happened in Latakia. One fighter pilot sent a Sidewinder out and it accidentally bombed the port in Latakia. It is not a full-scale attack, but look at the slant and the way the news is reporting it. There has been no reaction from the Pentagon, which at this hour of night is lightly staffed. However, it is reported that high Navy and Defense Department officials are being summoned into an emergency conference. We will give you more on this as we receive it from our Washington newsroom. Here is the text of the official Arab broadcast. At about 6 o'clock tonight, this morning, please remember that it is morning in the Eastern Mediterranean, which is 7 hours ahead of American Eastern Standard Time. Low-flying jet aircraft of the type used on United States aircraft carriers and bearing United States insignia brutally and without warning bombed the harbor area of Latakia. It is reported that civilian casualties are high and that many buildings are in flames. This was the text of the Arab broadcast, and that is all the hard news we have at the moment. Latakia is the most important Syrian harbor. Within the last few years, it has been heavily fortified, and there has been extensive construction of submarine pens under the direction of Russian technicians. It is generally regarded as one of the most powerful anti-Western naval bases in the Mediterranean. It is known that units of the United States Sixth Fleet are now in the Eastern Mediterranean, and that these units have been shadowed by fast, unidentified aircraft. The network announcer went on to other news, and Randy's phone rang, and he picked it up, irritated. It was Bill McGovern. Did you hear the news? Bill asked. Yes, I'm trying to get more of it. What do you think? I don't think anything yet. I want to hear our side of it. Sounds to me like we're starting a small preventative war, Bill said. I don't believe that for an instant, Randy said, and you don't prevent a war by starting one. Well, we'll see who's right in the morning. And the sun has gotten a little bit unbearable here, so we are going to be switching locations underneath the porch. Like I said, we changed locations because it was getting a little bright out there in the sun. Marc Bragg missed the first news flash on Latakia. The moment he was straightening up the house before driving to Offutt to assume direction of intelligence analysis in the whole. He had been recalled from the Puerto Rico mission because SAC's Commander-in-Chief, General Hawker, felt that in the newest crisis, senior members of his operations and intelligence staffs should maintain a round-the-clock watch. An attack is rarely planned to conform to a victim's 5-day, 40-hour work week, so Hawker divided his most experienced officers into 3 shifts covering the whole day. As SAC's third-ranking intelligence officer, junior to the A2, and his deputy, both brigadiers, Colonel Bragg naturally drew the most onerous hours, midnight to 0800. At 11 p.m. Omaha time, while the Damascus broadcast was being repeated around the world, Marc was in the children's rooms feeling like an intruder. It was the silence that discomforted him. He found himself tiptoeing, listening for the missing sounds. The house was still as northern woods in winter, when all the creatures are gone. Ben Franklin's room looked as if it had been ransacked by a band of monkeys rather than a 13-year-old boy had packed. Marc closed dresser drawers and picked up ties and clothes hangers and shoes and socks, never in pairs. He supposed all boys were like that. Peyton's room looked no different than if this had been an ordinary day, as if she had been invited to a slumber party at the house of a friend and would return in the morning. Her bedspread was uncreased, and the furry toy animal that had held her pajamas rested precisely in its center as always. She had forgotten it. Her doll collection, carefully propped up on a tier of shelves, formed a silent audience to his silent inspection. Peyton hadn't asked to take her dolls to Florida. Perhaps she was outgrowing dolls, or perhaps she didn't realize when she left them that it might be forever. Her desk was neat, pencils aligned as if at squads. Right. School books stacked in a pyramid. He picked up the books and took them downstairs. He would mail them from Offutt in the morning, after he was off duty. Peyton was a tidy and thoughtful little girl, in looks and temperament, much like her mother. He loved her. He loved them both. They had been very satisfactory children. The house was intolerably quiet. In the whole house, the only sound was the ticking of clocks. Driving toward Offutt and his job, Marc felt better. When he turned into the 4-lane highway that ran south to the base, he saw that it was 11:30 and he flipped on the car radio. It was then that he heard the Arab charge that Latakia had been bombed by American planes, and in addition, a rather strange statement from Washington. A Navy Department spokesman, the newscaster said, denies that there has been any intentional attack on the Syrian coast. Marc stepped on the accelerator and watched the speedometer needle pass 75. On a turn, the back wheels weaved. Ice. He forced himself to concentrate on his driving. Soon he would know everything that was known in the whole, which meant everything that was known to American intelligence and the worldwide news networks everywhere. Meanwhile, it was pointless to guess or end up in a ditch, a useless casualty with no Purple Heart. 12 minutes later, Marc entered the war room, 50 feet underground. Blinking in the brilliant but shadowless artificial sunlight, he glanced at the map panels. Nothing startling. He walked on to the offices of A2 Intelligence. In the inner office, Dutch Klein, Deputy A2, and a buck general in his early 40s waited for his relief. An electric coffee maker steamed on Dutch's desk. 2 ashtrays were filled with crushed cigarette butts. Dutch had been busy. Dutch said, "I guess you've heard the news. I caught it on the radio. It's not true, is it?" "It's fantastic." Dutch touched a sheaf of pink flimsies, decoded priority messages on his desk. 2 hours ago, 6th Fleet scrambled fighters to intercept a jet snooper. An ensign from Saratoga, an ensign, mind you, sighted the bogey and chased him all the way up the Levant. He closed at Latakia and fired a bird. Whether it was a human error or an erratic rocket isn't clear. Anyway, everything blew. Dutch, a muscular, keg-shaped man with a round, rubbery face, groaned and sank back into his chair. Automatically, the fortifications of the port area of Latakia came into focus in Marc's mind. Large stores of conventional mines, torpedoes, and ammo, he said. They usually have 4 to 8 subs in the new pens and a couple of cruisers and escort vessels in the harbor. He hesitated, thinking of something else, worse. The fire and blast could have cooked off nuclear weapons if they were in combat configuration. That could well be. What do you make of it? Worst foul-up on record, Dutch said. Glad it's the Navy and not us. I mean, how do you think that the Russians will react? Marc asked the question not because he thought Dutch would give him the answer, but as a catalyst to his own imagination. Intelligence wasn't Dutch's primary interest. On the way up to 2 stars in command of an air division, Dutch had been forced to assimilate 2 years of staff, part of his education. To Marc, the intelligence job, with all its political and psychological facets, was a career itself. He had a feel for it, the capacity to stir a head full of unrelated facts until they congealed into a pattern arrowing the future. Dutch said, maybe it'll throw them off balance. Might upset their timetable, Marc agreed, but I'm afraid they're all set. It might have just give the Kremlin a casus belli, an excuse. Dutch lifted himself out of the chair. I leave it with you. The CNC was here until a few minutes ago. He had to go get some sleep because it might get even hairier tomorrow. If there are important political developments, you're to call him. Operations will handle the alert status as usual. For 30 minutes, Marc concentrated on the pile of pink flimsies, the latest intelligence from NATO, Smyrna, Naples, the Philippines, the Eastern Sea Frontier, and the summaries from Air Defense Command and the CIA. When he was abreast of the situation, he crossed the war room to Operations Control. The senior controller on duty was Ace Atkins, a former fighter pilot like Marc, an Eagle colonel. He was called Ace because he had been one in 2 wars. Because of proven courage and absolute coolness, he was at the desk now, occupied with a red phone a few inches from his fingers. One code word into Ace's red phone would cock SAC's 2,000 bombers and start the countdown at the missile sites. It would take another word, either spoken by General Hawker or with his authority, to launch the force. Ace, slight and wiry, looked up and said, "Welcome to Bedlam." The control room, separated from the war room by heavy glass, was utterly quiet. Marc said, I'm worried. I wish Washington would come forth with a complete statement. As things stand now, most of the world will believe that we attacked Latakia deliberately. Why don't the Navy information people give out? They want to. They've got a release ready, but they're low echelon. And you know Washington, not very well. I know it well, Marc said, and I think I can pretty well guess what's happening. Everyone wants to put his chop on it because it's so important, but for the same reason, nobody wants to take the responsibility. The Navy PIO probably called an assistant secretary, and the assistant secretary called the secretary, and the secretary probably called the Secretary of Defense, and by that time the Information Agency and State Department were involved. By now, more and more people are getting up and they're calling more and more people. People looked at the clocks. Marc looked at the clocks above the war room maps, telling the time in all zones from Omas to Guam. It's 2 a.m. in Washington now. As each man gives his okay to release it, it turns out that somebody else has to be consulted. Eventually, they'll have the Secretary of State out of bed and then the White House press secretary. Maybe he'll wake up the president, but until that happens, I don't think that there will be any full statement. Ace said, my God, that sounds awful. It is, but what worries me most is Moscow. What's Moscow saying? Not a word, not a whisper. Usually, Radio Moscow would be screaming bloody murder. That's what worries me. As long as people keep talking, they're not fighting. When Moscow quits talking, I'm afraid they're acting. Marc borrowed a cigarette and lit it. I think the chances are 60-40, he said, that they've started their countdown. Ace's fingers stroked the red phone. Well, he said, we're as ready as we'll ever be. 14% of the force is airborne now, and another 17% on standby, and I'm prepared to hold that ratio until we are relieved at 0800. How's that sound to you, Marc? As always, the responsibility to act lay with the A3, Marc Bragg, as A2 could only advise. He said, "That's a pretty big effort. You can't keep the whole force in the air and on standby all the time. I know that, and yet..." He stretched. "I'll trot back to my cave and see what else comes in, and I'll check with you in an hour." On his desk, Marc found copies of 3 more urgent dispatches. One from the air attaché in Ankara reported Russian aerial reconnaissance over the Azerbaijan frontier. Another from the Navy Department gave a submarine sighting 200 miles off Seattle. Definitely a skunk. The third, received by the State Department from London in the highest secret classification, said that Downing Street had authorized the RAF to arm intermediate-range missiles, including the Thor, with nuclear warheads. In an hour, Helen's plane would touch down in Orlando. In 2 hours, if the plane was on time, Helen and the children would be in an area of comparative safety. Marc prayed that for the next 2 hours at least, nothing more would happen. He held fast to the thought, so long as there was no war, there was always a chance for peace. As the minutes and hours eroded away and no word came from Moscow, he became more and more certain that a massive strike had been ordered. He diagnosed this negative intelligence as more ominous than almost anything else that could have happened, and determined to awaken General Hawker if it persisted. At 3:30 in the morning, Randolph Bragg waited in the Orlando's air terminal for Helen's flight. With only a few night coaches scheduled in from New York, plus the non-stop from Chicago, the building was almost completely empty except for sweepers and scrub women. When he saw a plane's landing lights, Randy walked outside to the gate. On the other side of the field, near the military hangars used by Air Sea Rescue Command, he saw the silhouettes of 6 B-47s, part of the wing from McCoy, he deduced, using this field in accordance with the dispersal plan. The military hangars and operations buildings were bright with light, which at this hour was not usual. The big transport came in for its landing, approached on the taxi strip, pivoted to a halt before him, and cut its engines. He saw that only a few people were getting off. Most would be going on to Miami. He saw Peyton and Ben Franklin come down the steps, Ben incongruously wearing an overcoat, and Peyton carrying a bow, a quiver of arrows, over her shoulder. Then he saw Helen, and he waved, and he ran out to meet them. Randy rumpled Ben Franklin's hair. The children were both owl-eyed and tired. He leaned over, kissed Peyton, and relieved her of the bow slung over her shoulder. Helen said, "She's been watching Robin Hood, and she thinks that she's Maid Marian." Helen was wearing a long cashmere coat and carrying a fur cape over her arm. She appeared fresh, as if starting rather than completing a journey. She was slight. Marc sometimes referred to her as my pocket Venus. Yet, Randy was never aware of that except when he saw her completely relaxed. At all other times, her body seemed to obey the physical law that kinetic energy increases mass. Her abundant vitality, she somehow communicated to others, so that when Helen was present, everyone's blood flowed a little faster, as Randy's did now. She tiptoed to kiss him and said, "I feel like 10 kinds of a fool, Randy." He said, "Don't be silly." They walked toward the terminal. She presented him with a sheaf of baggage checks. "Marc made me take everything. We're going to be an awful nuisance. And also, I feel like a coward. You won't when you hear what's happened in the Med." Ben Franklin turned suddenly awake and said, "What happened in the Med, Randy?" Randy looked at Helen inquiringly. She said, "It's all right. Both of them know about it. I didn't realize it until we were on the plane. Children are precocious these days, aren't they? They learn the facts of life before you have a chance to explain anything." While they waited for the luggage, Randy spoke of the news, and they listened gravely. Ben Franklin alone commented, "Sounds like the kickoff. I guess Dad knew what he was doing." Nothing more was said about it for a time. Randy felt relieved when the suburbs of Orlando were behind them and the traffic thin at this hour. He was holding to a steady 70. He thought his apprehension illogical. Why should he be upset by the remark of a 13-year-old boy? When he was sure the children slept in the back seat, he said, "They take it calmly, almost as a matter of course, don't they?" "Yes," Helen said. "You see, all their lives, ever since they've known anything, they've lived under the shadow of a war. Atomic war. For them, the abnormal has become normal. All their lives, they have heard nothing else, and they expect it." "They're conditioned," Randy said. "A child of the 19th century would quickly go mad with fear, I think, in the world of today. It must have been pretty wonderful to have lived in the years, say, between 1870 and 1914, when peace was the normal condition and people really were appalled at the idea of war and believed that there would never be a big one. A big one was impossible, they used to say. It would cost too much. It would disrupt world trade and bankrupt everybody. Even after the First World War, people didn't accept war as normal. They had to call it the war to end wars, or we wouldn't have fought it. Helen, what has become of us?" Helen, busy tuning the car radio, trying to bring in fresh news, said, "You're a bit of an idealist, aren't you, Randy?" "I suppose so. It's been an expensive luxury. Maybe one day I'll get conditioned. I'll accept things like the children." Helen said, "Listen." She had brought in a Miami station, and the announcer was saying that the station was remaining on the air throughout the night to give news of the new crisis. "Now we have a bulletin from Washington," he said. "The Navy Department has finally released a full statement on the Latakia incident. Earlier today, a Navy carrier-based fighter fired a single air-to-air rocket at an unidentified jet plane which had been shadowing units of the 6th Fleet. This rocket exploded in the harbor of Latakia. The Navy calls it a regrettable mechanical error. It is possible that this rocket struck an ammunition train and started a chain explosion," the statement admits. "The Navy categorically denies any deliberate bombardment. We will bring you further bulletins as they are received." The Miami station began to broadcast a medley of Second World War patriotic songs, which Randy remembered from boyhood. One was "Praise the Lord and Pass the Ammunition." It sounded tinny and in poor taste, but Miami's entertainment was usually in poor taste. Randy said, "Do you believe it? Is it possible?" Helen didn't answer. She was staring straight ahead as if hypnotized by the headlight beam, and her lips were moving. He realized that her mind was far away. She had not heard him. Randy had them all in their rooms and asleep by 5:30, and he carried all their luggage, 11 bags, upstairs. He went to his own apartment and collapsed on the studio couch in the living room, and Graff jumped up and snuggled under his arm. Almost at once, without bothering to loosen his belt or remove his shoes, Randy slept. It was 0500 at Offutt Field, with dawn still more than 2 hours distant, when General Hawker, unbidden, returned to the hole. The general followed in the tradition of Vandenberg, Norstad, and LeMay. He had received his 4th star while still in his 40s, and now, at 50, considered it a part of his job that he remained slim and in excellent physical condition. Once warfare, except among the untutored savages, had been fought during the daylight hours. This had changed during the 20th century until now rockets and aircraft recognized neither darkness nor bad weather and were handicapped neither by oceans nor mountains nor distance. Now, the critical factor in warfare was time, measured in minutes or seconds. Hawker had adjusted his life to this condition, and in the past week he had slept no more than 4 hours at a stretch. He had trained himself to catnap in his office for 10 or 20-minute periods, after which he had felt remarkably refreshed. The engineers who designed the hole had arranged that the Commander-in-Chief's command post be on a glass-enclosed balcony from which he could see all the war room maps and all the activity on the floor below. and be surrounded by his staff. In this moment, it wasn't operating like that at all. Hawker had his feet up on the desk in the control room, and he was drinking black coffee from a green dime store mug and rapidly reading through a stack of the more important operational and intelligence dispatches. Occasionally, the general fired a question at one or the other two colonels, Atkins and Bragg. An A2 staff sergeant came into the room with two pink flimsies and handed them to Marc Bragg. The general looked up inquiringly. Marc said, "From the Eastern Sea frontier, patrol planes on the Argentina-Bermuda axis report 3 unidentified contacts. These skunks are headed for the Atlantic coast." "Sounds bad, doesn't it?" "I think this one sounds worse," Marc said. "All news service and diplomatic communications between Moscow and the United States have been inoperative for the last hour. This comes from the USIA. The news agencies have been calling their Moscow correspondents, and all the Moscow operators will say is, 'Sorry, I am unable to complete the call.' And there's been no reaction to Latakia from Moscow at all?" "None, sir, not a whisper." The general shook his head, slowly, frowning, lines appearing and deepening around mouth and eyes, his whole face undergoing a transformation, growing older as if in a few seconds all the strain and fatigue of weeks, months, years had accumulated and were marking his face and bowing his shoulders. Hawker said, "This is the witching hour, you know. This is the bad one. Their submarines have had a whole night to run in on the coast, if that's what they're doing. We're in darkness. They'll soon be in daylight. Dawn is the bad time. What time does it start to get light in New York and Washington?" "Sunrise on the eastern seaboard is 7:10 Eastern Standard," Ace Atkins said. Washington's clock read 6:41. Marc Bragg's mind raced ahead. If an attack came, they could count on no more than 15 minutes warning. If they used every one of those minutes with maximum efficiency, retaliation could be decisive. But Marc feared a minute or even 2 might be lost in necessary communication with Washington, and he made a bold proposal. "May I suggest, sir, that we ask for the release of our weapons?" This was the one mandatory essential act that must precede the terrible decision to use the weapons. Under the law, the President of the United States owns the nuclear bombs and missile warheads. General Hawker was entrusted with their custody only. Before SAC could use the weapons, the permission of the President or his survivor in a line of succession must be secured. If an attack were underway, that permission would come almost, but not quite, instantly. The general seemed a little startled. "Don't you think we can wait, Marc?" "Yes, sir, we can wait, but if we get it out of the way, it could save us a minute, maybe 2. The danger and the necessity of not having a communication snafu must be just as apparent in the Pentagon or the White House or wherever the President is as it is here." "What do you think, Ace?" Hawker asked. "I'd like to have it behind us, sir." The general picked up one of the 4 phones on Atkins' desk, the phone connecting directly with the Pentagon command post. In this CP, day and night, was a general officer of the Air Force. The duty officer was never out of communication with the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The general spoke briefly into the phone and then waited, keeping it pressed against his ear. Marc's eyes followed the red second hand on the desk clock. This was an interesting experiment. The general said, "Yes, John, this is Bob Hawker. I want the release of my weapons." Marc knew that John was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. "Yes, I'll hold," the general said. The seconds raced away. The general said, "Thank you, John. It is now 11:44 Zulu. You will confirm by teletype. Goodbye, John." The general reached across the desk and wrote in Ace Atkins' log, "Weapons released to SAC at 11:44 4 Zulu. The operations log was kept in Greenwich time. Marc said, I timed it, 1 minute and 35 seconds. I hope we don't need it, Hawker said, but I'm glad to have it. The worry lines became